When learning and developing a new skill set, everyone starts that journey in their own way for any one of a number of different reasons. Certainly, I hope that my videos on my channel help you and inspire you to improve your legal and business writing. That's the reason why I produce these videos. I thought it might be useful for you and helpful for you to find out a little bit about how I started my journey in terms of how I started teaching legal writing, how to improve your legal writing skills, because I think there might be some lessons there that you can also benefit from. So that's what this video is going to be about. It's about how I discovered the key to improving legal writing and the things that might help you too. So let's get started on that. So let's have a look at the beginning. So I started working as an English teacher about 2008. Then I started working almost exclusively with lawyers and working in-house in Poland from around about 2010, 2011. So that's when I started getting involved in the area of legal English in a really deep way, having taught legal English in various different language schools for a couple of years beforehand. As is a common road for people who teach English in-house, you get asked to have a look at some documents, then you start editing those documents, and then I became a proofreader, and so I started doing that pretty much 50-50 alongside teaching legal English at the same time. I was asked once upon a time to help analyze some legal writing, and the reason why I was asked to help was because the lawyer who was speaking to me, senior lawyer at the time, said that they were getting some feedback from their clients that they weren't happy with the written communications, and that they wanted me to have a look at them, to look at the communications, to find out what was going on, how could the writing be improved, how could the lawyer-client relationship be improved through better communication. So I said, okay, fine, this sounds like a challenge, so off we go. So I approached the problem with my English language teacher hat on. I was looking for errors, I was looking for errors in writing style, I was looking for grammar mistakes, punctuation mistakes, and everything else, the kind of typical thing that English language teachers look for. And I realized very, very, very quickly that there were no substantive or consistent errors. In fact, the writing was at C2 level. And if you're not familiar with C2, what C2 level is, C2 level is, as you can see just here, this is mastery or proficiency in a language. So that was the problem. I was given a piece of writing. I was told that there was something wrong with the writing because the client's not happy with it. But then it's C2 level and it was very good without any kind of consistent errors or anything like that. So what do I do with that document? Where do I go from that? How do I then respond to the person saying, well, you know, there's nothing wrong with the document, but you've still got a problem? Something didn't quite make sense. So I had to try and identify what was the problem. So back then, with AI nowadays, maybe it would be a little bit easier. But back then, it was I had to turn to Google to try and find out why would a client not be happy with a C2 text. I also had the problem of trying to find out why or how I could explain to a lawyer who was proficient in English why there's something wrong with their writing. So two problems really. One, try to identify the problem. Why did the client have a problem with this? And number two, I had to go to a lawyer and say to them, yes, your English is almost perfect or perfect, but there's still a problem. So I really needed to know what the problem is, and I really had to make sure that I had a strong argument to begin to persuade the lawyer and the partner exactly what was happening. So as I said, back then I turned to Google and I asked Google, what is good legal writing? I couldn't think of anything else to do at the time other than to turn to Google. And it was then that I started to find out a little bit more. I started to discover academic papers because if I write, we talk about prompts nowadays, but then I instructed Google to say what is good legal writing. If I said what was good business writing, or what was good writing, or what's good writing for non-natives or something like this, then I dare say the results would be different. But I specifically said, as you can see here, what is good legal writing, and it, amongst all of the results, it came back with academic papers, things like Legalese versus Plain English, an empirical study of persuasion and credibility in appellate brief writing. Benson and Kessler, very important paper. What is good legal writing, and why does it matter, by Osbeck. Persuading judges, an empirical analysis of writing style, persuasion, and the use of plain English. And I started reading, and I started finding out more, and I looked at the references. I started looking at the references, reading more papers and more papers and more papers. I then started to come across the doctrine writers who've been writing, as it turned out, for decades about how lawyers can improve their communication. People like Professor Garner, Professor Widdick, Martin Cutts, amongst others. Then I started coming across resources, fantastic resources, which will help lawyers improve their legal writing skills. And remember, all of these resources are not aimed towards non-natives. They are aimed towards natives, so largely American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealandish, etc., etc. These documents and resources were written to help so-called native lawyers improve their legal writing skills. So back to the resources. So for example, if you're not familiar with Clarity, and I am a member of Clarity, but I'm not being paid to promote the organization, although I would always recommend that you would join Clarity as a fantastic resource and as a fantastic community to join. Clarity promote plain language, legal language, and engage, as you can read there just over my shoulder, citizens around the world through promoting the use of plain language in legal communications. There's the Michigan Bar Association. This is a fantastic resource. Once again, a huge fan of this. I'm not being paid to promote this. It's just something that you guys should know about. I've talked about this before in videos many years ago. They've been writing articles every single month since about 1984 about how lawyers can improve their legal writing. So after beginning to really absorb all of this information, a number of things were being communicated about what is better legal English communication and what that should be replacing. By definition, we can say not as good legal English communication. And the focus became clear. The focus of the writing became clear that lawyers should be writing, thinking about the reader, not focusing on themselves and the skill sets they have as educated lawyers, as educated writers. And that was the fundamental change in approach. Not to think about your skill set and how you communicate your skill set, but to think about how the reader will interpret your text, how the reader will understand your text. I've said this before, and I'll say this again many times. In my opinion, I've always got to preface it in that way. If you have a fantastic language skill set and you communicate at the highest level, at C2 level, and you're speaking to someone who doesn't have the same language skill set as you, who understands a language at a lower level, then yes, you're educated, yes, you've got all of these skills, but you cannot communicate. Or rather, your communication is not successful, or your communication is wasted, because the person who is relying on that communication, very often in a client-lawyer relationship, can't understand what it is that you're trying to say or what you've written. So from that point of view, your skill set ultimately is a bit useless. If you cannot effectively communicate so that the person who is paying to get that information can understand it, then you've got to kind of question yourself, what am I doing? And I guess that was the crux of the problem of what I was presented with a number of years ago when the senior lawyer came to me and said, listen, I've got this writing and there's clients not happy with the writing. It's not because the writing was poor in terms of, like, say, English language quality. it was evidently because the client couldn't understand, or the client couldn't act upon the information that they were being given. That's where the problem was. So plain language, the plain language approach, became key in how to improve legal English communication. So what's the answer? As I said, adopt plain language techniques in your writing. Now, there's lots to be said about plain language techniques, and there are so-called lots of criticisms about plain language techniques. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of it here because it will make the video too long. Needless to say, plain language techniques is about effective communication. It's not about dumbing down the language. Clearly, lawyers don't talk in the way that doesn't make them look good, if you understand what I'm saying. They are professional people, they are highly educated people, they know what they're doing, but successful lawyers very often are those which can communicate at the appropriate level using plain language techniques, either through training or just through nature. So that's what I started to do in-house with the lawyers that I was working with. I created a course based first of all on Garner's and Widdick's book, and that was the first course that I published on YouTube, as you can see here. The 3 sections, as I had then in my course, are now available free of charge on YouTube, and they are amongst the most watched videos that I have on this channel. Unit 1, subject, verb, object, the kind of classic plain language technique or plain language communication, because this is how people talk in everyday communication. So why would written communication adopt a policy or adopt an approach which would do something that's not normal? But that's very often what happens with legal writing, by favoring the passive voice, by favoring really complicated structures. So it's just kind of not normal communication. I've produced also online and available on my YouTube channel a 50-lesson course, quick lessons about how you can improve your professional English writing skills in general. Once again, it goes over the basics. It's a little bit more developed. It looks at things in slightly more bite-sized chunks and a little bit less, let's say, clunkily. First series that I did was many years ago. I think over 10 years ago I started posting those videos online, and compared to the production of today's videos, it could be described as clunky. These videos from this course, Quick Lessons to Improve Your Professional English Writing Skills, I put online about 6 years ago, and yes, they're not perfect, but they're a little bit more human compared to that first course. And the videos that I do now, hopefully, I'll also touch on those topics. We'll also have a look at how to improve your writing technique using plain language styles, and hopefully there'll be the opportunity to work together on YouTube through live broadcasts and through various other means. But we've also got this wonderful doctrine that was published in 2023, the Plain Language ISO 24495, which is the Plain Language ISO, quickly followed 2025 by chapter 2 of that same ISO, which is on legal communications. And if I can just bring that in here so you can see what that is. Oh, hang on. So ISO 1, once again, I'm not being paid by ISO, and I wouldn't recommend, I would recommend that you are interested in this. There's certainly lots of information that you can get about this ISO available for free online. So for example, if you click on read sample, simply looking at the table of contents that you can see over here, reading the foreword, reading the introduction, reading the scope. So this is all freely available on the website. Then you can learn a lot from that. If we go and have a look at chapter 2, which is the part on legal communication, once again, you can also read a sample and you can find out a little bit more about what that ISO is about and how it might apply to your legal writing. I'll do a video in the future a lot more in depth on the freely available information that we've got and the key takeaways from that. But needless to say, there is an international standard now that says this is what legal written communication should look like at, and it sets the standard, being called a standard, of the level it should be at, the things that you should be thinking about. So these are fantastic things. When I started doing this in 15 years ago, 16 years ago, that would have been a fantastic piece of doctrine available at the time. But there's doctrine that I've been working with, Brian Garner's books, Professor Widdick's books, which were been on the market for decades. Also fantastic pieces of doctrine. So the doctrine is out there. It's just a question of finding it. I hope through my videos you will be able to find that as well. Moving back to this, and just to wrap up, just moving towards the conclusions, there is an established body of empirical evidence, as you can see here, overwhelmingly showing the legal professional and clients prefer plain language comms. So in general, you've got to think that lawyers are normal people as well, engaged in the profession. And when lawyers get together, they don't suddenly communicate in this weird and wonderful language, which is legalese. They talk to each other normally. They talk to their clients normally. They go to conferences and talk like normal people. And so communication within the legal world is normal communication. It just happens that in writing, sometimes for various different reasons, it becomes really, really unnecessarily complicated. And so we'll look at that in more detail in a different video. So what do I want you to take away from this video? What are the conclusions? ISO 24495 is the most important piece of legal writing doctrine for lawyers and people engaged in business who write. Essentially, everyone. If you are writing professionally, you should know about the plain language ISO, and you should be applying the principles of the plain language ISO. This should be the fundamentally important guiding document, most important document, guiding how you think about communication. In my opinion, this runs contrary, as you can read here, to a lot of English exams that stress the need to use, particularly at proficiency level, so C2 communication, obscure vocabulary and difficult structures, which is the trap of those proficiency exams. I'll talk more about that with plenty of examples in a future video about how communication at that level is not effective communication for everyday business needs. As I said, this is evidenced by the fact that I was given a writing which was at C2 level, which was perfect, essentially, but for the business purposes, it wasn't a very good piece of writing. The challenges that lawyers faced in the past are relevant today. These challenges don't go away. The situation has improved in the sense that we have an ISO, we have doctrine, and there's more awareness, but the problem of bad writing still remains. And there are a number of reasons for this. Inertia, people don't want to change, that you have peer pressure, that your senior lawyers say you've got to write in this way. But ultimately, the biggest problem is that you go through an education process, through university, through passing bar, where you are exposed non-stop to bad writing. And so by nature, you assume that bad writing is how you should be writing as well. And so that shapes your approach to writing. So here, you're kind of listening to the messages saying that you shouldn't, okay, yes, that writing exists. Yes, we've got to interpret that. Yes, we've got to understand that. But you yourself should be communicating in a different way. You need to think about your writing in a different way. Ultimately, the question you have to ask yourself is your writing process reader focused, or is it writer focused? Are you thinking about the reader when you're writing, or are you thinking about yourself? Getting back to that moment when I was asked to analyze the document, why was this perfect piece of writing a bad piece of writing from the point of view of business? Why was the client unhappy? It was because, with the benefit of experience, and I can say, it was because it was writer focused and it wasn't reader focused. If the lawyer knew, as lawyers do now, know about plain language techniques, about the commercial realities of writing, that you have to communicate in the way that you're understood, that there is a value in your writing, then it would have been a different document. It would have been designed in a different way. It would have communicated the same message but in a different way. It would have been structured differently. There are a number of different plain language techniques that could have been applied, which would have changed the document into a much more accessible document where the client could have found what they were looking for, that they could have understood the text that they received, and then they could have used that information that was communicated to them in a way that would help them in their business. So that's why I do what I do. That's why these videos are here. That's why there's an ever-growing body of doctrine that supports the idea that lawyers, the plain language approach is preferable to, let's say, the old-fashioned legal English approach. And that's ultimately my story. I hope that you find this kind of walk down history lane for me a little bit useful. I hope that it gives you a little bit of a better understanding of why these changes are important, and the commercial reality, which I need to stress in these videos, is that you need to communicate in a way in which you are understood, and the problems of communicating in a way where you are not understood. Incredibly important in today's ever more commercial, ever more AI legal world.